The city was wrapped in an amber glow as the evening sun painted the buildings with soft, warm hues. Emma stood by the large window of their modern, sleek apartment, staring out at the bustling streets below. The hum of the city outside, the faint sounds of honking cars and distant chatter, felt like an echo of the life she was living. Busy but hollow. She reached for her cup of coffee, the coldness of it reminding her how long she'd been standing there, lost in thought. It had been years since she'd felt truly present in this life. She looked down at the city, but her mind was miles away. Her thoughts were tangled, like the millions of strands of hair she absent-mindedly ran her fingers through. You okay?" Luke's voice broke through the silence. She turned around and smiled weakly, her husband standing in the doorway of their kitchen, still in his work suit. The immaculate cut of his clothes, the polished look of his shoes, it all screamed success. He was everything she thought she wanted. Smart, driven, kind. But tonight, as every night before, she couldn't shake the feeling of being alone in her marriage. Alone in her own life. "Yeah, just thinking," she answered softly, setting the cup back down on the counter. Luke's eyes softened as he stepped toward her, his hand brushing against her shoulder in that reassuring way that made her feel cared for, even if it didn't seem enough anymore. He reached for her waist, pulling her gently into his embrace. She melted into the familiarity of his arms, but it wasn't the same as it used to be. There was something missing. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but it had been building for months. Maybe even years. "You don't have to think about work tonight," Luke murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "We'll have a quiet evening. You, me, and a bottle of wine." She smiled again, this time for real. "You're right. I don't know. I've been thinking about how much things have changed." Luke stepped back, looking down at her. His face, so familiar, still held a certain charm, but there was something disconnected about it now. Maybe it was the tired look in his eyes, or the way he always seemed so preoccupied with his next big project. She had always supported him, always made sure he had everything he needed to succeed. But somewhere along the line, she'd stopped asking herself what she needed. "I guess that's just part of growing up, isn't it?" Luke said, trying to lighten the mood, his voice not entirely sincere but not quite distant either. "You get so caught up in the grind." Emma nodded absently, looking away toward the window again. She didn't want to be the one to bring up the truth. She didn't want to voice what she had been feeling for too long. The emptiness that lived in their relationship. The loneliness in a marriage that, on paper, was perfect. They had everything they needed, the apartment, the good jobs, the friends, the vacations. But none of it filled the space between them. "Yeah, I guess so," she replied, her voice trailing off. A silence stretched between them. It was comfortable, but Emma could feel the distance between them growing. She could feel herself fading into the background of their life together. Luke cleared his throat, his voice lighter now. "I'm going to make dinner. You can relax." Emma nodded again, grateful for the break, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't enough. She didn't know what she wanted, or if she even knew how to express it, but this wasn't the life she imagined for herself. She had always pictured her relationship with Luke being full of passion, of deep emotional connection. Instead, they were two strangers, comfortable with the silence that had come to dominate their time together. As Luke turned to leave the room, she watched him, her thoughts tumbling over one another. She had never been one to make rash decisions. She had always been careful. She had built a life with Luke that most would envy. But as she stood there, watching him pull out the pots and pans, the realization hit her like a heavy weight. She didn't feel seen anymore. Not by Luke. Not by anyone. The image of her life, perfect on the outside, seemed to blur. What had started as a dream seemed to have evolved into a routine, where every day felt like the one before. It wasn't just her marriage that felt lacking. It was her whole life. And then, she remembered something. A message. From someone she had never expected to hear from again. Someone who had made her feel alive in a way she had long since forgotten. The memory of that message sent a pulse through her. The simple, innocent text asking how she was doing. It had been weeks since she'd thought about him, but the feelings that rushed back were undeniable. This person had been her old friend, Jason. She hadn't seen him in years. Their connection had been undeniable back then. And now, with her marriage faltering in ways she couldn't ignore, his message was like a lifeline thrown her way. For the first time in a long time, Emma found herself wondering what it would be like to feel something real again. She wasn't sure if it was the right choice, but the pull was undeniable. She turned away from the kitchen, her mind racing with the possibilities. Emma's phone sat on the table, the message from Jason still lingering in her notifications. Every time she glanced at it, the weight of temptation grew heavier. She had spent the last few hours in a haze, trying to ignore the thoughts swirling in her mind. But as Luke hummed in the kitchen preparing dinner, Emma couldn't help but feel like she was suffocating. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she unlocked the screen. The message from Jason was simple. "Hey, it's been a while. How've you been?" The words were innocent enough, but to Emma, they felt like a doorway opening to something she hadn't realized she missed. A feeling of being noticed, of being wanted. It wasn't that she didn't love Luke, she did. But somewhere along the way, the spark had dimmed. It had been replaced with routine, with obligations, with the daily grind of life. And now, here was Jason, reminding her of a time when things were different. When life was full of possibilities and excitement. She pressed her thumb against the keyboard, her thoughts racing. What should she say? Should she tell him everything? Should she confess how badly she had been feeling, how empty her life had become? Instead, she typed back a short reply. "I've been okay. A lot has changed since we last talked." Emma hit send, and immediately regretted it. She stared at the screen, willing herself not to panic. What was she doing? Was she really about to open this door, knowing what it might lead to? Before she could second-guess herself, the phone buzzed in her hand. Jason had replied. "I get it. Life can get complicated. But I've been thinking about you. I hope everything's all right. I know we've both moved on, but you were important to me." Her heart skipped a beat. His words were so genuine, so warm, and they sent a rush of nostalgia through her. She remembered the way he used to look at her, the way he made her feel seen. Luke, for all his kindness, had never quite understood her like Jason had. Emma sat back in her chair, holding her phone close to her chest. The decision now seemed almost inevitable. She wanted to reconnect with Jason, even if just for a moment, to see if the chemistry they once had was still there, or if it was simply the fading echoes of a past life. She stood up, walking to the kitchen, where Luke was humming a tune under his breath, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. "Hey," she said softly, her voice betraying the inner conflict she felt. Luke turned to her with a smile, but Emma could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He hadn't noticed anything different about her. "Hey," Luke replied, setting down the knife and wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Everything okay?" Emma hesitated, trying to find the right words. "Yeah, I think I need to talk to you about something." Luke's smile faded slightly, his concern growing. "What's going on?" She stood there for a moment, unsure of how to explain. How could she tell him that she was feeling lost in their marriage? How could she admit that, after all this time, she was starting to crave something outside of their life together? Before she could answer, her phone buzzed again. She glanced down at it instinctively, and Luke saw the fleeting look of anxiety cross her face. "You're not still on that thing, are you?" Luke asked, his tone joking, but there was a sharp edge to it. He had always been sensitive when it came to her distractions. "No," Emma quickly replied, locking her phone and shoving it into her pocket. "Just work stuff." He nodded, though the skepticism in his eyes didn't go unnoticed. "I know work's been rough for you, but if something's bothering you, you know you can always talk to me, right?" "I know," Emma said softly, her voice thick with emotion. But the truth was, she didn't know if she could talk to him. Not about this. The evening passed in a blur, and before Emma knew it, they were seated at the dining table, plates of pasta between them. The soft lighting from the candles on the table made everything seem normal again, almost like it used to be. Luke smiled at her, as if trying to reassure her that everything was fine, but the smile didn't reach her heart. Emma could feel the divide between them, growing with every passing minute. She chewed her food slowly, nodding occasionally when Luke made small talk, but she couldn't focus on his words. Her mind was still on the message from Jason. Her phone buzzed again, and she couldn't stop herself from glancing down at it. Another message from him. "I know it's been a while, but if you ever want to catch up, let me know. No pressure, just friends. But I'd love to hear from you." The words were simple, and yet they sent a rush of excitement through her veins. Emma's thumb hovered over the keyboard, the temptation to respond overpowering. She wanted to feel alive again. She wanted to feel wanted. But then she looked up at Luke, who was smiling at her, waiting for her to respond. His eyes were kind, but there was something else in them now. A subtle suspicion, as if he had picked up on the tension in her silence. "Are you okay, Em?" Luke asked again, his voice more serious now. "You seem a little distant." She felt her throat tighten, the weight of her emotions pressing down on her chest. "I'm fine," she said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." Luke nodded, but his expression told her that he wasn't convinced. He always seemed to know when something was wrong, but tonight, it felt like the distance between them was something he couldn't reach. After dinner, Emma went to the living room, the coldness of the apartment wrapping around her like a blanket. She stood by the window again, staring out at the city. She couldn't deny it anymore, something was missing. And as she reached for her phone once again, she made her choice. She typed a quick reply to Jason. "I'd like that. Let's catch up." The moment she hit send, a weight lifted off her shoulders. She knew she was walking a dangerous line, but at that moment, the pull of the past felt stronger than the life she had with Luke. She didn't know what would come of it, but for the first time in a long time, Emma felt like she was doing something for herself. The night felt longer than usual. Emma lay awake in bed, her back to Luke, staring at the ceiling. The darkness seemed to amplify the noise in her mind, the hum of doubt, desire, and confusion swirling within her. She had made the choice. She'd opened the door to something she hadn't known she needed, and now she wasn't sure if she could close it again. Luke's steady breathing was the only sound filling the space between them. He had no idea what she was going through, the secret she was keeping. The message she'd sent to Jason had set something in motion, something she couldn't unsee or undo. She turned over, her back facing Luke now, but she could still feel the warmth of his body next to hers. Couldn't he sense how far away she felt? Couldn't he feel the distance that had grown between them? Her phone buzzed again. It was Jason. "How about tomorrow evening? Just us catching up. No strings, I promise." The words felt like an invitation to something that could be beautiful or catastrophic. But either way, it was something she had been craving for too long. She stared at the screen for a long moment, unsure. She wasn't even sure if she wanted to meet Jason to relive what they had, or if it was simply an escape from everything that had weighed down on her. But it didn't matter now. She had already stepped off the edge. The only question left was how far she would fall. She tapped out a quick response. "Tomorrow works." The moment she sent it, she regretted it. The finality of it hit her, but there was no turning back now. She locked her phone and slid it back into the drawer of the nightstand. She didn't want to feel guilty, but guilt swirled around her, pushing her deeper into her own head. What did this say about her? About her marriage? Could she really blame Luke for everything? Or was this just about something missing inside of herself? The next day passed slowly, as if the hours were dragging themselves in reluctance. Emma went through the motions, making dinner, responding to Luke's small talk, all the while her mind was somewhere else. The pull toward Jason, the anticipation, was overwhelming. She couldn't focus, couldn't ground herself. She felt untethered, drifting further from the life she had built, yet she couldn't stop herself from drifting. She had started to feel invisible to Luke, even when he was right there beside her. There was no spark anymore, no rush of emotion when he kissed her or touched her. There was only routine, only a comfortable, safe monotony. But safe didn't always feel good. Safe had started to feel suffocating. By the time the evening came, Emma was already mentally preparing for her rendezvous with Jason. She had told Luke she needed a little time to herself, a quiet evening, just to clear her head. He'd given her an understanding smile, as if he saw it all as something normal, something she just needed to process. But Emma wasn't processing. She wasn't reflecting. She was running. She put on a soft sweater, the one she knew always made her feel like herself, and fixed her makeup. She wanted to look good, to feel like she still had it, like she was someone worth noticing. She made herself a drink and sat down, her phone in her hand, waiting. It buzzed again. "I'll be waiting at the cafe, just like old times." Her heart skipped, but she smiled a little. A part of her had missed Jason, not just for the physical attraction, but for the way he saw her. The way he had made her feel special, like she mattered. The time finally came. She stepped out of the apartment, locking the door quietly behind her. As she walked toward the cafe, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her decision. She had never done this before, never snuck away like this. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was something she had to do. That it had nothing to do with Luke, but everything to do with herself. When she arrived at the cafe, Jason was already there, sitting at a table in the corner, a glass of wine in front of him. He looked up as she approached, and his face lit up. "Emma," he said, his voice low and warm. "You look amazing." The compliment hit her like a wave, and for a moment, she was flooded with the feeling of being seen again. Really seen. She smiled, sitting across from him. "Thank you," she said softly. She studied him for a moment, the familiarity of his face pulling her in. The man she had once been in love with, the man who had always made her feel important. They chatted for a while about life, about their past, about the little things that used to matter so much. It felt easy, like picking up where they had left off. But Emma couldn't ignore the subtle undercurrent of tension that was building between them. There was something electric about this meeting, something that had been missing for so long. And then, as if by instinct, Jason reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. The touch sent a jolt through her, and she looked up, meeting his gaze. There was no more hiding now, no more pretending. She knew where this was going. "Emma," Jason said, his voice thick with something she couldn't ignore. "I've missed this." "Missed you?" She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. "I've missed you too," she whispered. The words hung in the air between them, the gravity of them shifting everything. Her heart raced as Jason leaned in closer, his breath warm against her skin. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions coursing through her. The guilt, the desire, the pull of something that felt so right and so wrong all at once. Without thinking, without even realizing it, she kissed him. It wasn't the soft, hesitant kiss of old friends reconnecting. It was deep, hungry, like they were trying to make up for lost time. The kiss deepened, and Emma felt herself being drawn into him, into the intoxicating feeling of being wanted, of being needed. The years of longing, the moments of missing something she couldn't name, all seemed to come crashing down in that one kiss. It felt like she had come home, but it also felt like she was walking away from everything that mattered. She pulled away first, gasping for breath. Jason stared at her, his eyes dark with desire. "I didn't think you'd come back," he said quietly. "But I'm glad you did." Emma stood up quickly, her mind spinning. She had made a mistake. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. But she didn't know how to stop now, how to pull herself away. This wasn't about Jason anymore. It was about the hollow feeling that had been building inside her for so long. "I'm sorry," she muttered, backing away. "I need to go." Before Jason could respond, she was already out the door, her footsteps echoing in the quiet street as she rushed back to her apartment. When she arrived back, Luke was sitting on the couch, watching TV. The weight of everything that had just happened felt like a physical burden. She stood there, staring at him for a long moment, unsure of how to begin. How could she tell him what had happened, when she didn't even know what it meant? He glanced up at her, his face soft. "Hey, you okay?" Emma nodded, though the words lodged in her throat. She wanted to tell him everything, to explain how she had been feeling, how lost she had become. But she didn't know how to make sense of it. How to make sense of herself. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She sat down next to him, feeling the familiar warmth of his presence, but it didn't feel like enough anymore. She wasn't sure what she needed, what she wanted. All she knew was that the man sitting beside her wasn't the reason she had kissed Jason. It was something inside her. Something broken that she hadn't known how to fix. But as she looked at Luke, she knew it was going to take time to put the pieces back together. The morning after was a quiet storm. Emma woke up with a sharp sting in her chest, the space beside her empty and cold. The night had brought no peace, only the weight of what she'd done, the guilt settling in her stomach like a rock. She knew Luke wasn't going to ask. He was good like that, always letting her keep her secrets. But Emma couldn't keep this one locked away. Not anymore. She had crossed a line, and she had to face it. The temptation to avoid it, to let the world keep spinning around her, was strong. But something inside told her she needed to confront the truth. She found Luke in the kitchen, making his morning coffee as if everything was normal. She stood in the doorway, hesitating, trying to find the words. But there were no words for what had happened. Not really. Not enough to explain the emotions flooding her. The shame, the relief, the anger. All of it tangled together in one messy knot. "Luke," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned around at the sound of her voice, offering her a smile, a warm, inviting smile that made everything even harder to handle. "Hey," he said, setting the mug down. "How'd you sleep?" "I didn't," she replied truthfully, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Luke, we need to talk." The smile faltered, but only for a second. He nodded slowly, his eyes softening with concern. "Yeah, of course. What's going on?" Emma stepped closer, suddenly feeling as if the walls were closing in on her. She ran her fingers through her hair, the tension in her shoulders making it hard to breathe. The weight of the confession felt unbearable. I did something," she began, her throat tightening as she struggled to form the words. "I met someone last night. Jason." The name hung in the air, a knife slicing through the morning stillness. Luke blinked. His expression didn't shift immediately, but his hands tightened slightly around the mug in his grasp. His eyes were locked on hers, but there was a flicker of something deep beneath the surface. Something Emma couldn't quite read. "I kissed him," she added, the words falling out like stones from a heavy sack. "I didn't mean to, but I did." There was a long silence, the kind that felt like time itself was holding its breath. Luke didn't speak for what felt like an eternity. His face was unreadable, his features carved in stone. He didn't look angry, not exactly. But he looked hurt. "You kissed him?" he asked finally, his voice strained but not raised. "You met up with him and kissed him?" "I didn't plan it," Emma said quickly, desperate for him to understand. "It just happened. I don't even know why. I'm so sorry, Luke. I don't know what I was thinking." Luke set the mug down gently, his hands lingering on the counter as he took a deep breath. His eyes closed briefly, as though he were steeling himself for something. "I don't know what to say, Emma," he replied, his voice low. "I don't know if there's anything to say. What happened to us? What happened to our marriage?" Emma wanted to reach out, to comfort him, to take away the hurt she had caused, but she couldn't. She felt like a stranger in her own skin. "I don't know either," she admitted. "I've been feeling lost for so long, Luke. And then I saw Jason and I thought maybe I could feel something again. Anything." "That's not how this works, Em," Luke said quietly. His voice cracked a little, betraying the emotion that was just beneath the surface. "You don't just go kissing people when things feel off. That's not how you fix things." "I know," Emma whispered, her heart breaking. "I didn't fix anything. I made it worse. I don't want to lose you, Luke. I don't want to lose what we have, but I don't know how to fix this." Luke's gaze softened then, just a fraction, as he met her eyes. "Do you want to fix this?" The question hit her like a wave. She hadn't been sure of anything for so long, but in that moment, she realized just how badly she wanted to make things right. Yes, I do." Luke stepped closer, his expression unreadable. He took her hand gently, his fingers warm against hers. "Then we'll have to start with the truth, Emma. With everything. Not just the easy parts. The hard stuff, too. If we're going to fix this, we need to start talking. Really talking." Tears welled in her eyes, and she nodded, grateful that he wasn't pushing her away. She had broken something inside of him, but there was still a sliver of hope there, something they could rebuild. "We'll figure this out," she promised. "I'll do whatever it takes." The days that followed were slow. They really talked, about everything, about what had gone wrong, about the distance that had grown between them, about their desires and their fears. It wasn't easy. There were moments of silence, moments of anger, but there were also moments of understanding. Luke didn't let her off the hook easily, and she didn't want him to. She needed him to be honest with her, to show her that he still cared enough to fight for their relationship. But slowly, piece by piece, they started to rebuild what they had lost. Jason tried to reach out to her again, but Emma ignored his messages. She knew deep down that she didn't need him. What she needed was Luke, the man who had stood by her for years, the man she had once built a life with. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be bumps along the way, moments when they both questioned if it was worth it. But Emma was finally willing to put in the work, to fight for the love that had always been there, waiting for her to realize it. She and Luke didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, they had a sense of clarity. A sense that, maybe, they could find their way back to each other. And that, for Emma, was enough to start.